The first time the police arrived at our house, I thought it was a mistake, something trivial that would vanish as quickly as it came. Because Magnolia Ridge Estates had always been the kind of neighborhood where the loudest sound was a lawnmower on Saturday morning, and even the occasional barking dog seemed polite and on schedule, but the knock on the door was different, sharp and deliberate, like the kind you see in crime shows or tense movies. A rhythm that made my pulse spike before I could even fully process the situation, and when I wiped my hands on the towel and approached the door, peering through the frosted glass, I could see 2 squad cars parked neatly in front of the manicured lawns, their red and blue lights flashing silently, reflecting off the pastel-colored walls and perfectly trimmed hedges. And then I heard a small voice behind me saying, "Dad," which made my chest tighten because it was my son, Tyler, tall, broad-shouldered, 19, with a quiet intensity about him that made him seem older than his years. Someone who had already been through more than most people his age could imagine, though I knew only fragments of what he had endured in the Navy. And I told him to stay inside while I opened the door. And the 2 officers standing there, hands resting near their belts, looked official but not threatening. Yet there was a tension in the air that made it clear they were here on more than a casual visit, and when one of them asked if I was Mr. Harris, and I confirmed, he said they had received complaints about suspicious activity, vehicles coming and going at odd hours, and people wearing tactical gear, which made me pause, because I had no idea what to say. And then they asked if anyone else was in the house, besides Tyler and me, and I hesitated for a fraction of a second before admitting yes. There were guests, which was only partially true because what they didn't know was that these were not ordinary visitors, that my son had arranged for some of the most elite military personnel in the country to be at our home for reasons I couldn't fully explain. And as soon as I spoke those words, Tyler stepped forward with a calm I would never forget, saying, "That won't be necessary." And the officer's eyes shifted to him, trying to assess a man who looked young but exuded authority, and he asked if they were from the which confused the officers because they weren't. They were city police, here due to complaints about what the HOA had described as suspicious activity, and when the taller officer told Tyler to step outside, Tyler stood his ground, saying they might want to check who they were dealing with. And then, as if on cue, the front door opened wider behind Tyler, and 6 men stepped into view, all of them muscular, disciplined, eyes scanning every angle, their presence alone radiating authority and calm danger. And on their forearms, visible beneath rolled sleeves, were small tridents, the insignia of Navy SEALs. And the officers froze, realizing instantly that the situation was far beyond any HOA complaint. And one of the men stepped forward, politely greeting them, and calmly explaining that yes, they were the visitors causing concern. And Tyler, with a faint smirk, said, "You called the cops on Navy SEALs." And the silence was so thick you could feel it pressing in from the walls, and then the officers backed away, stammering apologies, and left without another word, while across the street our neighbor Linda Beecham, HOA, president, peered through her blinds, oblivious to the fact that her complaints had escalated to an encounter she could never have anticipated, and this all traced back to 3 weeks earlier when Magnolia Ridge had been quiet, a perfect postcard neighborhood, until Tyler's return from the Navy, supposedly on leave, but actually still connected to secret missions, which he never discussed. And men began arriving in dark SUVs and unmarked vehicles, conducting training in our backyard, practicing exercises and maneuvers that were foreign to me but terrifying in their precision. And every email from the HOA escalated, warning about unapproved guests, commercial activity, zoning violations, and noise. And when Linda and her board members personally confronted me about armed visitors and backyard drills, Tyler stood silently behind me, letting me handle it while mentally daring them to escalate further. And when they finally called the police after their complaints were ignored, I never imagined the response would turn into a standoff with actual Navy SEALs standing in my living room, polite but unyielding. And that day changed everything about how I understood my son, the neighborhood, and the very meaning of safety, because what seemed like a petty HOA complaint was in reality a test of character, of authority, and of the hidden lives that some people lead. And as I watched the officers drive away, and the SEALs nod respectfully before disappearing into the house again, I felt a strange mixture of fear, pride, and disbelief, knowing that the quiet life I had hoped for was gone, replaced by a reality that was far more complicated and dangerous than any suburban rulebook could have ever accounted for. And I realized in that moment that Tyler was not just my son, but a bridge between 2 worlds, the world I knew, safe and predictable, and the world he inhabited, a world of shadows, strategy, and lethal precision. And every neighbor complaint, every zoning notice, every small accusation had inadvertently collided with forces they could never have imagined. And as I sank into the sofa, trying to process the enormity of what had happened, I also recognized the silent promise in my son's eyes, that no matter what chaos followed, he and his brothers would protect the family, the house, and perhaps even the entire block from threats invisible to ordinary eyes. And from that moment on, the neighborhood, the HOA, and even I were swept into a story far larger than we had ever consented to. And the first knock at the door would remain forever etched in my memory, as the moment the ordinary collided with the extraordinary, when my son's secret life revealed itself not through words but through the sheer undeniable presence of men trained for war. Appearing in our suburban driveway, and as the sun set behind the trimmed hedges, casting long shadows across the lawn, I knew with certainty that nothing about Magnolia Ridge would ever be the same again. And yet, despite the fear, a quiet pride settled over me because I understood, finally, fully, and irrevocably, that my son's world was one of honor, courage, and purpose, and for reasons I could only begin to comprehend. I had been pulled into it, whether I was ready or not, marking the beginning of a journey that would test every notion of safety, loyalty, and family I had ever held dear. The morning after the police left, the tension in Magnolia Ridge Estates was palpable. Though on the surface everything seemed normal, the mailman dropped letters. Sprinklers hissed across immaculate lawns, and neighbors jogged past with their headphones in, pretending nothing had changed. But behind closed doors, whispers and glances told a different story, and Linda Beecham, the HOA president, was fuming, convinced that her complaints had been ignored and that her authority had been undermined by what she believed were young men playing pretend in the backyard. Unaware that those young men were some of the most elite warriors in the country, men trained to handle scenarios most civilians couldn't even imagine. And when she called an emergency board meeting later that morning, she didn't just want to discuss noise, complaints, or unapproved visitors. She wanted action. She wanted strategy. She wanted a way to regain control of her carefully curated world, a world of pastel houses, trimmed hedges, and rulebooks thicker than most of the neighborhood's residents had ever read. And so she outlined a plan to escalate new complaints, calls to the city, pressure on local law enforcement, zoning inspections, everything short of contacting federal authorities, because she believed that if she could paint the situation as dangerous or illegal, she could force Tyler and his guests to leave without ever confronting them directly. And yet she had no idea that every single move she made was being anticipated, observed, and catalogued, because Tyler's guests weren't just passing through. They were professionals who could assess threats, calculate risks, and respond with precision that made the idea of a suburban HOA seem almost absurd in comparison. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table that morning, coffee in hand, listening to the faint hum of conversation from the meeting room as Linda barked instructions at her board members, unaware that every word was essentially public because our home had cameras, sensors, and secure communications that Tyler had installed for reasons I didn't question anymore. And the irony that the most secretive, disciplined, and lethal men I had ever seen in my life were now somehow defending a suburban house against complaints about noise and landscaping was not lost on me. And it became clearer that day that the HOA was about to make a fatal mistake, because in their attempt to enforce rules and assert authority, they had underestimated the people they were confronting, and their ignorance would be costly, and so the letters continued to arrive thicker than before. Formal complaints about vehicle traffic, allegations of illegal activity, assertions that the property was no longer compliant with HOA covenants, even claims that the backyard workouts violated city ordinances, and with each envelope my sense of dread grew, but also a strange sense of awe, because Tyler and his men were calm, methodical, and almost serene in the face of what would have terrified any normal family. And as days turned into weeks, Linda escalated further, calling the city inspector and sending threatening letters with lawyers' signatures, insisting that the property be inspected immediately, and the inspector arrived clipboard in hand, walking past the neatly trimmed hedges and into the backyard where Tyler's team had arranged what looked like an obstacle course, not realizing that this was not play, but training, and as the inspector noted, the equipment, ropes, weights, MATs, and asked questions. Tyler calmly explained that these were personal fitness devices, part of a family exercise program, which was technically true, though the family in question included men who could dismantle entire security systems in minutes if needed. And when the inspector left satisfied but confused, Linda called another meeting furious that her plan to force the men out had failed, and began drafting letters, threatening fines, penalties, and potential legal action. And that's when Tyler decided it was time to make a subtle demonstration, not of force, but of presence. And one evening, he organized a small drill in the backyard that looked entirely normal to the casual eye. 2 men lifting weights, another running agility drills, but in reality, it was a precise choreography, timing, movements, and signaling, silently with gestures only their trained eyes could read. And when one of the HOA board members happened to glance over the fence, she froze unnerved, not by the exercises themselves, which looked mundane, but by the energy, the discipline, and the silent communication between the men. And she returned inside, visibly shaken, repeating to Linda that something about them didn't feel right. And Linda, instead of reconsidering, doubled down, convinced that if she pushed harder, she could assert control, not realizing that each complaint, each attempt at intimidation, was merely catalogued and assessed by people who had seen and survived far worse than HOA meetings. And the tension reached a peak when a neighborhood meeting was called at the community hall, ostensibly to discuss community safety and compliance. And Tyler attended with a few of his closest team members, blending in as ordinary neighbors, but projecting a quiet confidence that made anyone trying to intimidate them second-guess their assumptions. And as Linda spoke, detailing all the supposed violations and threats, Posed by the presence of these men, she noticed subtle nods, gestures, and slight changes in posture that told her nothing she said was having the intended effect. And when she threatened fines and legal action in front of the crowd, Tyler raised a hand politely, speaking clearly, explaining that everyone had a right to enjoy their home, that they were fully compliant with the law, and that any further escalation could have consequences, not through threat of violence, but through the authority and confidence of men trained to operate in life-and-death situations. And the room, once buzzing with whispers and murmurs of agreement with Linda, fell silent, the weight of realization settling in that these were not ordinary neighbors. And for the first time the board members hesitated, unsure whether to continue pursuing their campaign, and as the meeting concluded, Tyler and his team returned home, leaving behind a room of shaken HOA members who now had to confront the terrifying possibility that the rules and letters they had relied upon were powerless against a force they had no understanding of. And from that moment forward, the neighborhood's perception shifted. Quiet looks over fences, hushed conversations, and a strange, almost reverent distance emerged as residents began to realize that the people in the Harris household were not to be trifled with, that every complaint had been met with calm efficiency, and that escalating further could provoke consequences that no HOA handbook could ever prepare them for. And as I watched Tyler move through the house that evening, unpacking equipment, adjusting schedules, and quietly coordinating with his team, I felt a mixture of awe and fear, understanding for the first time the depth of his world, the discipline and danger he navigated daily. And I knew that the HOA's stubborn insistence on rules had only highlighted the contrast between their mundane authority and the extraordinary reality that my son and his team inhabited. And by the end of the week, the letters stopped arriving. The city inspections ceased, and Linda Beecham herself seemed hesitant, almost fearful, when walking past our house. Her confident demeanor replaced with caution, and it became clear that in their effort to enforce compliance, they had triggered a lesson in humility and respect that could not be reversed. And I realized that Tyler had not only protected our family, but had also sent a clear signal to the neighborhood, a silent declaration that while rules existed, some forces operated on a level far beyond HOA authority. And from that day on, every time I saw the trimmed hedges, the clean sidewalks, or the distant glance of a neighbor, I was reminded that our home was no longer just a suburban house. It had become a bastion of strategy, vigilance, and the subtle power of men trained to protect at any cost. And the lesson of section to the HOA's fatal mistake was that ordinary assumptions, bureaucratic complaints, and the illusion of control were utterly powerless in the face of discipline, training, and a resolve so quiet yet absolute that it reshaped the dynamics of the entire community, leaving everyone, even myself, in awe of what they had witnessed and in quiet fear of what might happen if anyone ever again misjudged who really lived behind the Harris front door. It was a quiet Thursday evening when the real crisis began, the kind that transforms ordinary life into chaos so subtly at first that no one notices until it's almost too late. And I remember sitting in the living room trying to read a book, though my eyes kept darting to the backyard, where Tyler and his team had already begun their evening routines, not knowing that the peace we had been enjoying since the HOA retreat was about to shatter. Because earlier that day, a local gang, small but notoriously reckless, had spotted the unusual vehicles and unfamiliar faces in our driveway while casing the neighborhood for petty theft. And their curiosity had turned into a dangerous plan, underestimating everything about our household. And as the sun dipped behind the manicured hedges, shadows stretching long and ominous across the lawns, I saw Tyler's calm face as he stepped outside, scanning the perimeter, and immediately I knew that he had sensed something. A tension in the air, a whisper of movement, a vibration that only those trained to notice the subtlest of cues could detect. And within minutes, his team was deployed in positions around the house, silent, disciplined, every movement precise, almost invisible. While inside, I felt my heartbeat speed up, a mixture of fear and pride, knowing that the people I had once thought were just guests were now my guardians in a real-world threat scenario. And then it happened. Headlights flicked on across the street, the sound of a car engine idling, unfamiliar, menacing, and my pulse jumped as the vehicle slowed, circled, and stopped near the edge of our property, while from inside, I could see Tyler signaling subtly with his hand, communicating silently with his team, their trained eyes reading gestures that to me were invisible. And I realized in that moment that this was not a drill, that the stories I had read about neighborhoods being invaded or threatened were now unfolding in our own driveway. And the gang, thinking they were scaring someone into compliance or theft, had no idea that they were about to confront men who had survived scenarios most people couldn't even imagine. And in a matter of seconds, the SEALs had positioned themselves around the house, almost like shadows, blending into corners behind trees. Near the garage, invisible but omnipresent, while Tyler stood in the middle of the lawn, calm as ever, his eyes scanning the vehicle and the faces of the men inside, reading intentions, calculating reactions, preparing for contingencies, and I, helpless and frozen, could only watch as the tension built into something almost cinematic. A confrontation that was entirely invisible yet palpable. And then one of the gang members stepped out of the car trying to act confident, walking toward our house, laughing as if this was a prank, unaware of the lethal precision waiting just beyond sight, and before he could even reach the first hedge, a low commanding voice from behind him stopped him in his tracks, and it wasn't shouting, it was calm, measured, filled with authority that made the man freeze mid-step, and when he turned he saw Tyler and 2 other men from his team standing in positions he hadn't anticipated, their posture relaxed, but their presence exuding an unmistakable warning that any misstep would have consequences far beyond his imagination. And the gang member stammered, trying to regain composure, pulling out a phone perhaps to call for backup, but a subtle gesture from one of the SEALs, a single flick of the wrist, made him drop the device instinctively, as if some unseen force controlled his movements. And then the rest of the gang, seeing their comrade immobilized, hesitated, panic spreading through them like wildfire, while Tyler, still calm, stepped a fraction forward, his voice steady, saying that they were trespassing and needed to leave immediately, and the words weren't threats. They were facts, backed by presence, skill, and an authority that no ordinary human could argue with. And as the men scrambled back to their car, one of them tripped, almost knocking the car into reverse. But a silent hand from the shadows corrected the situation, unseen yet perfectly timed, and the car sped away, leaving only tire marks on the asphalt and the echo of what had just occurred. And for several minutes, there was silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of sprinklers. And then Tyler turned toward me, smiling faintly, as if to say that everything was fine, that the crisis had passed, but inside, I knew that the neighborhood had been forever changed, because anyone who had witnessed the event, even from a distance, would never see the Harris household the same way again. And over the next several days, whispers circulated about what had happened, though no one could articulate it fully. Only hints, suspicions, strange glances over fences, hurried conversations with sudden silences, all signaling that people had a sense of the extraordinary without knowing the details. And in the aftermath, the SEALs remained, their presence a constant, almost invisible reassurance, conducting training, maintaining security, checking communications, all while maintaining the pretense of ordinary visitors. And Tyler moved among them with effortless authority, coordinating, teaching, leading, while I realized fully that this was not just about protecting our home, but about preparedness, vigilance, and the ability to act decisively in moments when ordinary measures failed. And every time the HOA or neighbors tried to interfere, even inadvertently, they were now reminded, subtly but unmistakably, that their complaints and assumptions were powerless against trained professionals. And the contrast between their bureaucracy and the quiet lethal readiness around our house was stark, almost comical, if not for the seriousness of what had occurred. And then, late one night, a knock at the door again, this time subtle, almost respectful, and Tyler opened it to reveal a man in plain clothes. Not one of the gang, not one of the SEALs, but a local law enforcement detective who had come quietly to apologize for the earlier misunderstanding. And when he realized who he was dealing with, he quickly backed off, leaving with a polite nod, while Tyler's team returned inside. And I finally understood what my son had meant when he said that this neighborhood had just gotten very quiet, because the message had been delivered in the most effective way possible, without violence, without overt confrontation, but through the sheer presence and competence of men trained to operate in life-or-death scenarios. And from that moment forward, the neighborhood seemed to operate under an invisible code of respect and caution, with people walking past our house carefully, cameras and security systems now a point of whispered admiration, while Tyler and his team moved with routine efficiency, training, monitoring, and maintaining readiness. And I began to understand the depth of what I had been thrust into, the responsibility of harboring men who could, with precision, neutralize threats, protect family, and maintain order in ways that no ordinary citizen could comprehend. And I realized that the real danger had never been the HOA, never the petty complaints, but what would happen if someone with ignorance and arrogance confronted forces they could not see, could not predict, and could not counter. And as weeks passed, the balance of power in the neighborhood subtly shifted, with Linda Beecham herself walking past our house more carefully, neighbors lowering their voices, children playing quietly, and the world outside our walls, acknowledging, in a wordless way, that some doors should never be knocked upon lightly, that the Harris household had become a fortress not of walls and locks, but of discipline, training, vigilance, and a quiet, almost invisible authority that demanded respect without a single raised voice or fired weapon. And as I sat there one evening, watching Tyler move from the kitchen to the backyard, instructing one of his team on proper tactical positioning, while simultaneously ensuring the safety of our property and family, I realized that the extraordinary had become the ordinary in our lives, that our reality had shifted in ways no HOA letter, city ordinance, or neighborhood rumor could ever undo. And I understood fully, irrevocably, that the story of the Harris household, the Navy SEALs visiting our home, and the crisis that had unfolded would remain with me etched into my memory. A reminder that true power and protection are often invisible, silent, and quietly unassailable, and that from that night forward, our house, our family, and our community had been subtly, permanently, and irrevocably altered. In the days that followed the incident with the gang, a strange calm settled over Magnolia Ridge Estates. Though it was a calm laced with caution, an almost subconscious recognition among the neighbors that the Harris household was no longer simply a family home but a hub of unseen authority and disciplined power, and even the HOA seemed hesitant, each member carefully considering every decision, every step, knowing that they had already overstepped in ways they could never undo. And I watched Tyler move through his home with the quiet command of a man who carried both the weight of experience and the responsibility of secrecy, training with his team, coordinating routines, checking security systems, and communicating with people and networks I could never fully understand. And while I had always known my son was exceptional, the reality of witnessing these Navy SEALs operating in our backyard silent, precise, and disciplined beyond measure, left me in awe of the layers of skill, strategy, and vigilance that now enveloped our family. And as the weeks passed, I realized that the true nature of their presence was not simply about defense against external threats, but a larger lesson in preparation, respect, and the invisible forces that govern safety and survival. And this lesson extended beyond our walls, subtly influencing the neighborhood, the HOA, and even my own understanding of authority and risk. Because while Linda Beecham and her board members could enforce petty rules, issue fines, and draft threatening letters, they were powerless in the face of real, disciplined skill that combined physical readiness, mental acuity, and strategic foresight. And then, one evening, a new development occurred. A series of suspicious vehicles had been observed near the edge of our neighborhood, strangers and unmarked cars, parked and circling, and Tyler immediately recognized this as a potential threat. Not unlike the gang that had approached before, though this time it was more organized, more methodical, and potentially dangerous in ways that required careful planning and immediate action. And without alerting anyone unnecessarily, he coordinated his team, positioning them strategically around the perimeter of our property, using signals, hand gestures, and subtle movements that would have been invisible to the untrained eye. And I watched from the window as shadows moved across the lawn, men blending into corners, trees, and darkened areas with seamless precision, while Tyler assessed the situation calmly, scanning the vehicles, the occupants, and the environment for any sign of hostile intent. And within minutes, a quiet confrontation was unfolding, entirely invisible to the casual observer, but palpable in its intensity. And when one of the cars attempted to drive closer, Tyler's team subtly intervened, guiding the vehicle away without escalation, using presence and positioning rather than force. And I was struck by the extraordinary skill in their actions. The seamless coordination that required no words, no audible commands, only perfect timing and absolute trust among the team. And when the vehicles finally left, the tension dissolved, leaving behind an almost surreal, quiet, a neighborhood unaware of the battle it had narrowly avoided. And I realized that this invisible defense had already become the new normal in our lives, a constant unspoken reassurance that danger could arise at any time, but that preparation and discipline could neutralize it before it ever materialized fully. And in the days that followed, Tyler continued to demonstrate the subtle power of presence, maintaining a routine of training, vigilance, and strategic oversight. And he began to quietly mentor a few young men in the neighborhood who showed potential, teaching them not just fitness, but situational awareness, discipline, and the quiet authority that comes with preparedness. And slowly, the aura surrounding our home transformed from fearsome secrecy to something else entirely: respect, and understanding among neighbors that the rules they had relied upon were secondary to real skill. And even Linda Beecham herself adjusted her approach, visiting less frequently, avoiding confrontations, and when she did communicate, it was with caution and a trace of acknowledgement that she had misjudged the situation. And as the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, with the Harris household standing as both protector and quiet deterrent. The presence of Tyler and his team ensuring that petty disputes, external threats, or careless assumptions could never escalate into danger. And I found myself reflecting on the journey from the first knock on the door to this point, the realization dawning that the HOA's initial complaints, the city inspections, and even the gang's foolish intrusion had all been catalysts revealing the depth, skill, and readiness of the people living within our walls. And I understood that the extraordinary had become ordinary, that my home was no longer a simple suburban residence, but a microcosm of vigilance, discipline, and the hidden power of preparedness. And I marveled at the lessons Tyler had silently taught the neighborhood, that authority is not measured in letters, fines, or complaints, but in skill, presence, and the ability to act decisively when required, and that even the smallest acts like positioning oneself strategically or reading subtle cues could prevent disaster without anyone ever realizing what had been averted. And one night, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, the shadows stretching across the lawns like fingers, I felt a profound mixture of pride, fear, and respect, knowing that my son had grown into a man whose life had always operated on a higher plane, and that the Navy SEALs visiting him had not just been guests, they had been the ultimate teachers, mentors, and protectors, embedding a new order into our lives and our neighborhood. And as the final chapter of this saga unfolded quietly, with no sirens, no confrontation, no public acknowledgement, I realized the final truth of our story, that power, protection, and respect often operate silently, unseen, and that those who underestimate what lies behind a closed door or behind a calm young man's eyes do so at their peril. And so the HOA learned, the neighborhood learned, and I learned that ordinary rules mean nothing in the face of extraordinary skill, and that a quiet household in a suburban neighborhood could contain forces that redefine the very idea of safety, vigilance, and authority. And as I turned to go inside, the last rays of sunlight reflecting off the windows, I understood fully that our lives had been forever changed, that the Harris household had become a fortress not of walls or weapons, but of discipline, training, and quiet, unassailable power, and that in every glance, every gesture, every silent movement, the lesson was clear to anyone who observed: respect what you cannot see, for behind calm eyes and ordinary doors may lie the extraordinary. And for our family, that extraordinary presence was not a threat, but a shield, a promise, and a reminder that courage, discipline, and preparation are the greatest forces of all, shaping the world quietly, invisibly, and decisively.